Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first official episode of the Diverse Thinking, Different Learning podcast, a podcast about learning differences. I am so excited that this podcast has finally launched. It has been months and months of preparation. I've been listening to podcasts for a while, and I've been interviewed as a guest on a number of podcasts. And I decided that I really wanted to do my own show. And I've been thinking about it for a while. But I was very busy as a professor, coordinator of a graduate program, chair of a psychology department, director of a private practice, founder of a startup, and a wife and mom. It was a lot. I have since retired early from my university position and did so that I could focus more on supporting families and the professional community who serve kids who struggle. On this first episode, I'm going to discuss why the identification of learning challenges is so important. And then I'm going to talk about what we do right and where we go wrong. Let's jump in. So my goal for this podcast is really for it to be a resource for parents who have kids at home who are struggling with learning, processing, or social emotional challenges, and also for educators who teach those kids. It's my hope that after listening to the show, parents and educators will better understand the challenges that some kids face and know how to help those kids overcome challenges, become more resilient, maintain a love for learning, and experience more success at school, on the playground, and at home. So here's what I know from being a neuropsychologist, from my training, from reading journal articles, and from interacting with incredible colleagues who do the work day in, day out with kids who struggle. What we do know is that approximately 5% of school-age children have a learning disability, right? And about 13% of all public school students receive special education services. And I think what's even more striking is that an additional 15% or more of students struggle due to an unidentified and unaddressed learning or attention issue. Right. So even though we're diagnosing or identifying kids who have a learning disorder, there's a large number of kids who are struggling and whose struggles are not yet identified. And when they're not identified, they're not being addressed. And those kids are continuing to struggle. And this has really been the bulk of a lot of the work that I do and the reason for the work that I do, because kids come to see me because they've experienced some kind of struggle in school or at home. And that struggle has either been identified by a parent, a pediatrician, an educator, a family friend who has mentioned to the parent that you might want to get this issue, this struggle, this behavior looked at to better understand how to help your child. What we know is that not all brains develop in the same way. And for some kids, the way their brains are organized cause them to have more struggles than their peers. And these struggles can look very different in different kids. For some kids, they may have trouble remembering directions. They may look like they don't want to listen, but it's really a struggle with understanding and following directions. For other kids, reading might be slow, effortful, and maybe even a little unpleasant, because it is such a difficult task for them. For some kids, they can do the work, but it takes them so much longer than their peers to complete the same task. Some kids will have trouble concentrating. Some kids will have trouble focusing on tasks that they're not particularly interested in, but can spend hours doing things that are not academic related. And those are tasks that we typically refer to as non-preferred tasks. Some kids may look unmotivated and they may be described as being underachievers. They may complain about school. Other kids may have a lot of really great ideas in their head, but when they put their pencil to the paper to get out their ideas in written form, they really have a hard time conveying that information in writing. And so for some kids, there can even be a disconnect between what they say and what they do. So they seem to understand a great deal when you're speaking with them, but when they have to show what it is that they know on a test, they really struggle. And when kids struggle, there often can be a misunderstanding. And with misunderstanding can also come mislabeling. So a child who is struggling with reading and who's sitting in a classroom and the teacher is calling on everyone to read out loud, that child may choose to leave the classroom without asking for permission, may choose to walk to the back of the room and start playing with a toy, and that child may be labeled as having a behavioral problem. At the same time, what's really happening is that there's a misunderstanding of an underlying struggle that this child is trying to avoid. And mislabeling can cause anxiety, it can lead to behavioral problems, and it can actually make difficulties worse. So what do we tend to do? And it's really interesting because when kids struggle, we see the struggle. We may not know why the child is struggling, but we definitely see the struggle. We observe the struggles, we observe the disengagement, we observe the frustration and the anger with homework. We observe the underachievement, and we hear it where a teacher might say, he seems really, really bright, but he's really just not interested in learning, or we're really having a hard time engaging him. And so we see the struggle and we observe the struggle. But often what we do, instead of trying to understand the struggle, is that we rationalize the difficulty. And I've heard it, and teachers have heard it, and other parents have heard it. We hear things like, he'll grow out of it, right? So when a boy is struggling with putting words together, they'll say he'll grow out of it, or he's having difficulty focusing or paying attention over an extended period of time. He'll grow out of it. A girl who's struggling with getting her ideas out, with participating in class, who seems very reserved. Some people might say, oh, she's just shy, right? That's just who she is. Some people might say, he's just lazy. He's really smart, but I think he's just lazy. He just doesn't want to work very hard. Or he's having more struggles with reading, with language-based tasks because he's a boy. Boys tend to develop a little bit later. It's because he's the youngest in the class. Or that's just, and you can fill in the child's name, that's just Jack, right? Sometimes you'll even hear, she just needs to work a little harder. If she just worked a little harder, she'd do fine. And I think that we actually do a disservice to kids who are really struggling with some underlying difficulties by rationalizing the struggles in that way. And I think one of the things we have to realize is that for kids to be successful, to perform a lot of academic tasks, there are a number of skills that are involved, right? So if you think about, for example, a child who's taking a test, they have to have really good fine and gross motor skills. They have to be able to hold that pencil and to write down what it is that they believe is the answer to that problem. They have to understand the directions while they're solving the problem. They have to focus and pay attention. All of those things have to happen at the same time in order for them to do well on a test, for example. Now, when children have a learning disorder, and we're going to talk about this a great deal in subsequent episodes and later episodes, but when kids struggle with a learning disorder, they typically experience trouble learning skills in the regular classroom. So they tend to be behind their peers in a particular area or in one or more areas. They tend to respond differently in a regular classroom, and they tend to require more specialized instruction and accommodations in order to do well. The problem is that when kids are struggling with a learning disorder, we don't always know that that's what the problem is. And if we just observe the problem without understanding it, we really can't get to the appropriate intervention. And one of the things I often like to talk about is an example of a kid who's struggling with reading, right? A child who's struggling with reading comprehension. So a child is is given reading assignments and the teacher notices that this child is really struggling with understanding information that is in the book on the page. So when a child is struggling with reading, one of the things that you can do is jump to intervention, right? You jump to a child is struggling with reading comprehension. Let's get him a tutor, right? And that's common to want to help this child read. But if you really don't understand the underlying issue behind the reading struggle, how are you going to know how to intervene? So I'm going to give you an example of a child who's struggling with reading comprehension. And reading comprehension, understanding what it is that you are reading, takes into consideration a number of different processes, right? There are a number of different things that need to be working well in order for you to understand what it is that you read. And any one of those things can break down and cause struggles with reading comprehension. So a child can have difficulty with reading comprehension because they have poor working memory. Working memory refers to your ability to hold information online or in your head while you're doing something else. So if a character pops up in the first chapter of a book and you keep on reading, and then they're not mentioned again until the second chapter, when they pop up, you have that representation of that character in your mind. You've been holding it in your head, in your working memory, and so that you can continue reading the story and understanding where that character fits in the context of the story. But if you have poor working memory, you might not even remember who that character was, or you might have to go back and reread that first chapter to remind yourself of who this character is. So a person with reading comprehension struggles can struggle because of poor working memory. For some kids, it's really poor phonological processing. They have difficulty sounding out the words on the page. And so what that looks like are kids who are struggling with reading the words, and they may make a number of errors. So when they're reading, a word like experiment becomes experience, there becomes this, car becomes cat, mat becomes more, and then the whole paragraph doesn't make sense, right? And so those reading comprehension struggles are really tied to a deficit in phonological processing. For some kids, they can read beautifully. They have no problem with reading fluency, with phonological processing. Their working memory is fine. But after they've read beautifully and they've retained the information that they've read, you ask them a question and they don't understand. That can be tied to difficulties with receptive language, which is the ability to understand language, understand vocabulary, understand what words mean, what phrases mean. And that intervention for a child who struggles with reading comprehension because of poor receptive language, that intervention will be very different than the intervention for a child who's struggling with reading comprehension because of poor phonological processing. So for some kids, they can read beautifully. They have no difficulty with phonological processing. They have no struggles with receptive language. But the trouble is with focusing and sustaining their attention, is that they're reading, they're getting distracted, they're paying attention to other things. They have to go back to the page. They have to reread, figure out where they were. Oh yeah, this is where I was. This is what is happening. And so those gaps in attention are causing problems with comprehension. For some kids, it's really the encoding of information. They really have a hard time converting that information that they're reading into their long-term memory so that they can remember it later. So while they're reading, they understand what they're reading. But then later on, when they're asked to answer questions about what they read the day before, they don't remember what it is that they read. So then it's really difficult to have understanding what you've read if you don't really remember what it is that you've read. And then for some kids, they can read well, but they just read more slowly. And so it takes them longer to understand information because it takes them longer to get through the text. So I highlight those examples because, again, if you see a kid who's struggling with reading comprehension and you jump to getting them a tutor without fully understanding why they're struggling, you can really do that child a disservice because you're not really addressing the underlying issue. And the same is true for writing. If you think about writing is such a complex task. It requires so many different things that you're doing at the same time. And any one of those things can break down and cause writing difficulties. For some kids, the struggle is with the mechanics of writing. They've got all these great ideas in their head, but they've got really delays or problems with the fine motor coordination. They may have muscle weakness in their hand. And so when they start to write, they get fatigued very easily. They can't form the letters well. And then they may just give up because it's just too hard, right? So that would be kind of a fine motor issue. For some kids, they don't have struggles with the fine motor process. Their fine motor skills are just fine. They've got all the great ideas in their head, but they don't know where to start. And that can be a struggle with task initiation. They don't know where to start. Or they do start and they have trouble kind of organizing all of their ideas. They've got all of these great ideas. They know what they want to write about. They know where they want to go with what it is that they're writing, but they can't organize it well and they can't plan it well. And then this whole difficulty with planning and organization, and they've got all these great ideas in their head. They feel completely overwhelmed, and then they may just step away from the paper, step away from the computer, and just procrastinate, right? Because that's a better way of dealing with the feelings of overwhelm. For some individuals with writing difficulties, it's really a struggle with expressive language. These are kids who struggle with finding the right words to put on paper, with finding the right organization of their words, right? How do I put these words together in the right way so they can convey what it is that I'm trying to say, right? So that may be an expressive language issue. And for some individuals with writing difficulties, like with reading, the issue can be attention, that they may start out okay, but they can't, or they struggle with sustaining their attention over an extended period of time. And so they get distracted, they walk away, time goes on, they start doing other things, and then it's 9 p.m., it's time for bed, and they've only written, the first 2 sentences. And so, again, that can interfere with their ability to really demonstrate their knowledge fully when they're writing. For some kids, the difficulties with phonological processing that impact writing also impact their ability to spell. And so they have trouble figuring out how to spell words. And those kids, again, have a lot to say. They've got a lot of great ideas, but they can't spell the words that they want to use in the sentences that they want to put on the paper and the paragraphs that they want to write. And for some kids, the spelling difficulties are so frustrating that they write as little as possible. These are kids who have these great ideas. They can tell you kind of paragraphs and paragraphs of things that they want to write. They have these great ideas, but their spelling interferes with their ability to really demonstrate what it is that they know. And so I'm highlighting reading and writing because, again, kids can have struggles with reading and writing for a number of different reasons. And if you don't know why a child is struggling, it's really hard to then give them the appropriate support and the intervention that they need in order for them to overcome the struggle and to be successful. So one of the things that I do in my private practice and that we do in my private practice is that we do evaluations. We assess kids who have struggles. And what we do is we uncover, again, the reason for the struggle. And when we do assessments, we do them because the assessment really serves as a guide for appropriate intervention to address the difficulties that a child is experiencing. And an assessment is important for a number of different reasons. One, you're going to identify whether the struggle is working memory, receptive language, expressive language, attention, memory, anxiety, a disturbance in sleep. And then you can really work to help that child overcome the struggle. But it's also important for a number of different reasons. And one of those reasons is when a child struggles with a learning disorder, what the research tells us is that 1 in 3 children with one learning disorder will also meet criteria for an additional disorder. And so it's not even enough to say, aha, we found that this child is struggling with a reading disorder, right? If we just think that a child is struggling with reading and we only assess for reading, we may miss another area of difficulty that that child is also struggling with. And so our approach to assessment is really to be comprehensive so that we don't miss anything. And that's particularly true because of what we call comorbidity, when what that means is that Kids who struggle with one issue often struggle with another issue, and we want to make sure that we're addressing both. And again, this really speaks to the need for an appropriate intervention because assessment informs intervention. And we know that when kids get the right intervention, we really can see the trajectory of their learning change significantly. What I have seen and what the research shows is that, for example, when we identify a child who's struggling with dyslexia, a specific learning disorder in reading, and we get the appropriate intervention and we utilize an evidence-based intervention that really targets those phonological processing centers in the brain. What we know is that when a child is struggling with reading, and we've identified that that reading struggle is tied, for example, to problems with phonological processing, problems with sounding out the words. When we can give those kids an appropriate intervention, one that really targets those underlying brain pathways that are organized differently, we can actually reorganize those brain pathways. And when we do that, kids become more fluent readers, which means they make fewer errors when they read. They read more quickly and they can better understand what it is that they read. But again, we have to understand where the struggle is so that we can really do the appropriate intervention and get the kids the appropriate intervention. And the same is true for a language-based disorder, kids who struggle with a language disorder. When we get them the appropriate intervention to address receptive language, expressive language struggles, we can see a significant improvement. And I've seen it in kids that I've assessed and who I've referred out for therapy. I've seen improvements in their ability to follow directions, understand directions, draw comparisons between words, understand language, express their language in beautiful ways in a way that they couldn't before. But again, the key was really understanding and identifying the language-based issue so that then we can address the struggle, address the neurodevelopmental disorder with an appropriate intervention. And so, one of the things we do in our private practice is that we assess for a number of different areas, particularly when we don't know why a child is struggling. And this holistic and this comprehensive approach can be important for a number of kids, particularly when you don't know the reason why they're struggling. But again, comprehensive evaluation may not always be necessary in all cases. So even though I'm a neuropsychologist, I'm not going to say that all kids who struggle need a full neuropsychological assessment because that's simply not the case. For some kids, there really is an emotional block, and that emotional block may be tied to anxiety. And if we know that there's a significant amount of anxiety, that kids, for example, may have had an early history of anxiety, they may have had problems with separating from parents early on. Their parents may have had to sit with them in the preschool classroom for, weeks on end to get them comfortable with being in a classroom setting. And then those anxieties may reemerge in elementary school. And that anxiety may prevent a child from fully participating and demonstrating what it is that they know. So maybe that we want to address the anxiety first if we know it's there before jumping into a full evaluation. But it's also important to know that if a child is struggling, is this a learning disorder? Is this a difference in the way that they learn information? Or is this anxiety? Or is it anxiety and a learning disorder? Because if a child has anxiety and they have a learning disorder, it's not enough to just do the intervention for the learning disorder. You also have to address the anxiety. And if it's just anxiety that's causing the issue, then you don't want to have a tutor help that child with his or her homework, because then again, you're not dealing with the underlying issue. And for an example, a child who's struggling with anxiety can be irritable. They can be extremely tired because they're anxious at night. They may be worried about school the next day. They may, again, have disturbances in their sleep, have difficulty with sleeping. They may fall asleep, but then get up a number of times in the night, and then they're fatigued during the day. And when they're fatigued, they may have poor concentration. And this can look like a child who has attention issues, but it can also be a child who's struggling with anxiety. And so identifying that anxiety is the primary issue is really important, because then again, you're dealing with the underlying issue. You're working on that issue so that that child can overcome the struggle with anxiety and then really have a better experience in school, at home, and in life. And similarly, same is true for sleep. It's interesting is that some kids will struggle with attention, and some teachers will think that this is probably an ADHD. It's probably an attention issue. And one of the things that we look at as clinicians is that we look at sleep, because sleep is such an important part of our lives, right? As human beings, we spend approximately 1/3 of our lives in a state of sleep, yet 70% of American kids and adults get insufficient sleep. And why that's important is because when kids and adolescents don't get enough sleep, what that looks like is poor attention. You get sleepiness in school. You get psychomotor slowing, which is really kids have a difficult time getting started. They're very slow moving. They can be very sluggish. They can have struggles with executive functioning, right? They can have struggles with thinking, with planning, with organizing, with sustaining their attention. And not because they have ADHD, it's because they got 8 hours sleep when they really need 12 hours of sleep. And so again, understanding the reason why kids are struggling is so important to making sure that you're supporting them and giving them what it is that they need to overcome the struggles that you're seeing. So understanding the struggle is a key piece. Getting an appropriate evaluation is another piece. And the identification of a learning struggle is important because, again, and I can't say this enough, when you understand why a child is struggling, then you can get the appropriate intervention. And without early and effective intervention, kids who are struggling with undiagnosed or unrecognized learning differences, neurodevelopmental disorders, those are kids who struggle and struggle and struggle, where people say, you'll grow out of it. It's because you're a boy. They're hearing these messages and they're realizing that this struggle is real for me. I'm really struggling with reading. I'm really struggling with focusing, with organizing, with planning, with getting my work done, with understanding what the teacher is saying. Those kids who struggle, when their issues are not addressed, they're at greater risk for anxiety. They're at greater risk for having a poor self-concept, for feeling bad about themselves. They're at greater risk for being depressed, for having a decreased frustration tolerance. They're at greater risk for having behavioral problems in the classroom, right? Because they're trying to avoid the thing that makes them feel less than. They're the ones who are kind of engaging in these behaviors that are not appropriate for the classroom because they don't want to be embarrassed by the fact that they're struggling with reading. They don't want to be called on by the teacher for, again, not paying attention, for not listening to the instructions. And later on in adolescence, when kids have years and years of academic struggle or even academic failure, they're at greater risk for abusing substances. And they're at greater risk for dropping out of school, for disengaging, and for not working hard to continue with the learning process and for finishing school. And I'm on a mission to change that. I really want to make sure that when kids are struggling, that their struggles are identified, they're identified early, that kids are getting the appropriate intervention that they need in order for them to be successful. Because early identification and intervention is more effective than waiting until children have experienced years of academic failure. And again, we have to move from observing the struggle to getting kids the appropriate intervention. And we have to stop rationalizing underachievement or struggles. We have to observe the struggles. We have to validate that those struggles are real, that you're seeing it at homework time, you're seeing it in the classroom, you may be seeing it on the soccer field or on the playground, and then moving pretty quickly once it's pretty much validated and seen in a number of different instances to evaluate the reason why kids are struggling. So again, what we want to do is that when we see kids struggling with learning, with processing information, we want to not rationalize the struggle. We want to really seek to uncover why they're struggling. And that uncovering process may involve a formal evaluation. Once we uncover why they're struggling, we want to move pretty quickly to getting those kids the appropriate intervention. And that intervention should be evidence-based. It should be not something that we're just making up on the fly, but it's rooted in research that supports that these interventions are effective. And we also want to make sure that we are uncovering kids' strengths because they have them. Kids who struggle with reading or with attention always have strengths in other areas. And we want to be able to know what those strengths are because those are strengths that kids can feel good about. And those are strengths that we can use to help kids compensate for areas of difficulty. We also don't want to underestimate the power of understanding and a supportive environment. And that includes the support of parents, the support of educators, and other family members. And again, the goal is really helping kids achieve their full potential. And we can do that by understanding why kids struggle, getting them the support that they need, and helping them be on their way to experiencing a better and more successful experience at school, at home, and in life. I would love to know if anything discussed in this episode resonated with you. Please let me know and share it with anyone you think would benefit from hearing the information. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope to see you next week.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.